Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are turning our attention to one of the most imposing, terrifying, and ultimately paradoxical figures in all of biblical history,
Nebuchadnezzar II.
the mighty king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He stands as this towering historical giant, but, scripture uses him as a profound theological lesson.
That's absolutely right. And for you, our listener, we're embarking on a deep dive based on a serious and a very detailed essay that's really tailored for thoughtful Christians.
Right.
Our goal here is to move past just the simple historical fact and understand how this man, this relentless conqueror who shattered the world of God's people, is actually a pivotal figure for grasping the sheer unshakable reach of God's rule over global powers.
And when we talk about Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't just walk into the story of Judah.
No.
He strode in as the ultimate hammer of Babylon. He's the figure responsible for, the most devastating event in ancient Israelite history, the exile. He oversaw the deportation of nobles and craftsmen, and the historical accounts are very clear. He commanded the burning of the magnificent temple in Jerusalem.
The visible anchor of their worship for 400 years.
Exactly. That devastation is recorded so plainly in 2 Kings. He is, by all human standards, the primary antagonist, an agent of destruction.
Yet this is where the essential tension of the entire biblical narrative concerning him really resides.
Yeah.
While his ambition was pagan, raw, and imperial, the prophet Jeremiah explicitly refers to him, without any equivocation, as my servant, the servant of the Lord.
To call the man who burned the temple my servant, that's not just a profound paradox.
It's a monumental theological claim about divine sovereignty.
It transforms him from a flat historical villain into, as our source puts it, a living lesson in the reach of God's rule. So our mission in this deep dive is to trace his entire astonishing arc. We're going to follow him from the summit of his extreme, self-glorifying pride,
All the way down to the valley of his utter animalistic humiliation.
and then finally, to his eventual, clear, and very public praise of the Most High God.
And in doing that, we're tracing how God manages to write perfectly straight with lines that history thinks it controls. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just conquering lands.
No.
He was unwittingly fulfilling divine decrees. He carried Judah away exactly as the prophets had warned.
Fulfilling that prophecy of 70 years of captivity.
Exactly. Announced by Jeremiah, he was the instrument of divine justice against Judah's persistent covenant unfaithfulness.
But the fact that this judgment was measured, that it was limited to 70 years by a divine promise, that suggests that even in this justice, there was a profound layer of divine kindness.
That's it. The judgment was temporary, not annihilating.
Right.
And that blend, where judgment is delivered by the enemy but its scope and timeline are strictly limited by a divine promise, that is precisely what provides hope for believers today.
How so?
Well, if you are living under political powers or societal systems or even economic structures that don't share your faith, this story reminds you that those powers are not autonomous.
It's a powerful illustration of God's overall sovereignty.
It is. It reflects that ancient wisdom we see in the Psalms and Proverbs, which assures us that, the heart of the king is in the Lord's hand, and he turns it wherever he wills.
That perspective is so crucial, especially before we dive into the details of Daniel's confrontations with him. To truly grasp the scale of this king's ultimate submission, we have to start by grounding ourselves in the incredible, intimidating scale of the empire he inherited and built. He wasn't operating in a small provincial context.
Absolutely not. So let's begin with part one, the historical and cultural background. We have to acknowledge the political environment that gave rise to Babylon. So paint that historical and cultural picture for us. What was the great transition taking place in the Near East when Nebuchadnezzar emerged?
The world was experiencing a seismic change. For nearly 2 centuries, the Assyrian Empire had been the uncontested superpower.
Right. They were brutal, efficient, and deeply feared. They're the empire that carried away the northern kingdom of Israel centuries before. Their might seemed absolute.
Indeed. But every empire, no matter how terrifying, has its twilight.
And the backdrop to Babylon's sudden ascent was the slow, agonizing, but inevitable crumbling of that Assyrian dominance.
So who was behind that?
Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar. He was the general who led the revolt that finally succeeded in breaking Assyria's back. And alongside the Medes, he destroyed their capital, Nineveh.
A huge power shift.
A seismic shift. And it allowed Babylon to emerge from the shadows and lay claim to the legacy of Mesopotamian rule. The prophet Nahum, for instance, he celebrates Assyria's destruction, noting the profound relief of the other nations.
So Babylon didn't just stumble into a power vacuum, they earned it. But they immediately had to defend that inheritance.
And the primary threat wasn't a domestic rival, but the other great power still lurking on the scene, Egypt. That sets the stage for one of the most pivotal military moments in the ancient Near East, the Battle of Carchemish. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, who was still the crown prince at the time, he engages the Egyptian forces and secures an absolutely decisive victory. A moment even marked in the biblical text in Jeremiah.
So this wasn't just a minor battle.
Oh no. This was the geopolitical event that ended Egyptian influence in the Levant and cemented Babylon as the new hegemonic power.
It's just astonishing how swiftly that changed the political landscape for Judah. One day, they're anxiously calculating which master to appease, Assyria or Egypt.
And the next, a totally new, highly aggressive power from the east is knocking at their door.
A much more dangerous power.
And that immediate shift was sealed by a rapid internal succession. Soon after the victory at Carchemish, his father died. Nebuchadnezzar had to abandon his campaign and race back to Babylon to claim the throne.
And that quick transition was key, wasn't it?
Incredibly key. It prevented any internal power struggles, which allowed him to immediately focus on extending control over all the city-states and nations, including Judah, that had previously looked to Egypt or Assyria. Suddenly, nations found Babylon's imperial ambition was on them.
Just as prophecy foretold. So that paints the political and military stage. But we can't talk about the king without talking about his city. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy is inseparable from the legendary city of Babylon itself. So, help us grasp the sheer physical and cultural splendor he built. Why was it considered a wonder of the ancient world?
Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was, in a word, unparalleled. His reign saw these massive, tireless building projects that transformed the capital into a declaration of absolute human power.
We're talking colossal scale.
Colossal. Imagine walking the streets, and not just ordinary streets, but processional ways lined with magnificent glazed, turquoise-blue bricks.
Wow.
With reliefs of bulls and lions. And these led to the towering Ishtar Gate, a monument designed to inspire awe and terror in anyone who saw it.
And we hear stories of the walls, the great defenses of the city.
The walls were legendary, not just one layer, but a dual system so wide that ancient writers claimed chariots could turn around on top of them.
Incredible.
The city was irrigated by the Euphrates, supporting the mythical hanging gardens, which, whether they were truly built or a later embellishment, they speak to the perception of opulence and technological mastery.
So Babylon was engineered to look like an eternal capital.
Built to last forever. A massive statement of self-sufficiency.
It sounds like a physical manifestation of human hubris, a city designed to prove that man did not need God.
Precisely. And culturally, that hubris was expressed through their religion. It was an incredibly rich and complex society, but it was centered around a massive pantheon of gods.
And their chief god was?
Marduk, often referred to as Bel. He's the patron god of the city. And the king himself was seen as Marduk's chosen vice-regent on earth.
And the court relied heavily on that particular intellectual class we hear so much about in Daniel.
The Chaldeans, yes. The term Chaldeans was a bit of a double-edged one. It referred to the broader ruling class, but specifically, it designated a highly specialized, learned aristocracy.
So these were the priests, the astronomers.
The soothsayers, the magicians, the counselors. They were the king's intelligence network. They advised on everything from agriculture to military strategy based on tracking stars and interpreting omens.
So they represented the pinnacle of human wisdom and calculation.
And divination, yes. They were the world's most sophisticated attempt to manage and predict the future without any recourse to the living God.
So into this world of unparalleled material glory, wealth, complex Marduk worship, and hyper-sophisticated human wisdom.
Into that world, the exiles from Judah stepped.
Young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were dropped into the very belly of the beast.
The cultural shock must have been staggering. These young Hebrews, raised on the laws of Moses, were immediately indoctrinated into the language, literature, and culture of Babylon.
And the goal was to erase their old identity.
To make them loyal servants of the empire. Yet from the very first chapter of Daniel, we see their quiet, determined resistance, their decision to keep God's law even in small daily choices like their diet.
And this sets up the fundamental theological conflict, doesn't it? The empire looked utterly invincible, built of baked brick and mortar and layers of gold.
But the prophetic counterview offered to the exiles insisted that this physical glory was merely temporary vapor.
Right.
The prophets insisted that Judah needed to shift their focus from the visual shine of Babylon to the substantive difference between true power and manufactured power.
And the contrast is?
It's devastatingly simple. Babylonian idols, like Marduk's image, have to be physically carried, transported, and protected by their worshippers, especially when a city is sacked.
Right.
But the living God, the God of Israel, is the one who carries his people, sustains them, and keeps his promises across the generations.
That is the ultimate contrast. The pagan god is a burden to be carried.
But the true God is the one who bears the burden of his people.
Exactly.
So though Babylon seemed to be queen over the world, a self-perception that led to arrogance, the prophetic word made it clear that this mighty city was ultimately operating on a very short, very visible leash.
Ready to be unmade by a single word from heaven.
The moment its divinely appointed task was complete, it's the essential setup. The mighty, seemingly invincible empire was merely a temporary instrument, subject to God's timing.
That beautifully sets the stage for part 2, the biblical narrative. We now move from the backdrop of Babylonian power to the direct personal confrontation between the king and the God of Israel. How does this overwhelming conqueror become so intertwined with Daniel's story? And how do we trace the systematic judicial process of God's judgment against Judah?
We can trace this engagement in 3 distinct chronological waves of judgment that Nebuchadnezzar executed against Jerusalem. And these are followed by the specific divine confrontations aimed at the king himself.
Okay, let's start with the first wave, which happens early in his reign.
This takes place in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah. Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem, but this isn't the final destruction yet.
No.
Instead, he demonstrates his dominance by carrying off some of the sacred vessels from the temple and, more strategically, taking select young men from the nobility as high-value hostages.
And this is when Daniel and his companions are taken.
This is the critical moment. Daniel and his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are taken into exile.
And this act, taking the cream of Judah's crop, wasn't just punitive, it was assimilative, right? These young men were intended to become the next generation of Chaldean-trained civil servants.
That's the design, to serve the empire that had conquered them. But even in that captivity, Daniel and his friends resolved to honor the Lord. And that sets up a confrontation that has nothing to do with armies, but with diet and wisdom.
And their immediate quiet obedience led to God granting them knowledge and wisdom.
10 times superior to all the Chaldeans in the land. It's an immediate, front-loaded demonstration. Babylon's most cherished wisdom cannot stand against the wisdom God gives his faithful servants.
But despite that demonstration of divine favor toward the exiles, the puppet kingdom of Judah remained unstable.
They kept looking to Egypt for help. Their loyalty was fragile.
Which leads directly to the second wave.
Described in 2 Kings 24. When Judah rebels again, Nebuchadnezzar returns. This time, the deportation is far more devastating.
This is when King Jehoiachin is taken.
Yes, the queen mother, all the officers, the fighting men, and crucial segments of the skilled population, the craftsmen and leaders, are all deported. This wasn't just punishment, it was surgical.
It was an act of hollowing out the city's strength.
Exactly, to ensure they could no longer pose a serious threat. The source points out that 10,000 people were taken in this wave. Judah was left significantly weakened, governed by a puppet king, Zedekiah, who had no real power base.
The lesson should have been clear. Submission to Babylon was God's decree for those 70 years.
It should have been. Yet Zedekiah, despite every prophetic warning from Jeremiah and the repeated evidence of God's judgment, still hardened his neck.
He relied on diplomatic maneuvering and hopes that never materialized.
And that hubris brings about the final siege.
The one we all know about.
That final siege, recorded in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, was bitter and prolonged. It was a time of immense suffering, with famine gripping Jerusalem. And when the wall was finally breached, the Babylonian forces were merciless.
King Zedekiah was captured,
Forced to watch the execution of his sons, and then brutally blinded before being dragged to Babylon in chains.
and the culmination of the entire saga is the utter devastation of the physical symbols of their faith and history.
The temple, which had stood since Solomon's time, was burned to the ground. The walls were leveled, the remaining population was carried away.
And yet the text frames this as a necessary spiritual house cleaning.
It does. It explicitly says the land was left to enjoy its Sabbaths, fulfilling the ancient covenant warnings that if they did not honor the Sabbath years, the land itself would enforce them through desolation.
So Nebuchadnezzar was simultaneously carrying out a measured collective judgment against Judah,
While the Lord was preparing to confront the king's personal pride and the foundation of Babylonian confidence in human wisdom.
Which leads us directly into Daniel. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It starts with the dream of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. And this is just a masterful setup to humiliate the entire Chaldean system.
It's more than just a dream. It's a brilliant trap. Nebuchadnezzar has a vision of a colossal statue, which terrified him.
Right.
But in an act designed by God to isolate Daniel and expose the Chaldeans, he demands that his wise men not only interpret the dream, but first tell him what the dream was.
And this is the moment where the limits of human divinatory wisdom are just laid bare for the entire court to see.
They can't do it.
They can't. They rightly point out, the thing the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods. And the king, enraged at the failure of the very institution he relied upon, orders their mass execution.
The wisdom of Babylon, the best their culture could offer, collapsed instantly under the pressure of a single forgotten dream.
Exactly. And then enter Daniel, who requests time, prays to the God of heaven, and receives the revelation.
But he doesn't take credit.
No, he immediately praises the God of heaven before revealing the king's dream. And the revelation itself is staggering. The statue was composed of these diminishingly valuable, yet increasingly stronger materials.
The head of gold.
Which was Babylon, then a chest and arms of silver for Medo-Persia, belly and thighs of bronze for Greece, legs of iron for Rome, and then the feet of mixed iron and clay.
And the significance of the materials is critical, isn't it? It's not just a list of kingdoms.
Not at all. It's a progression detailing the character of earthly empire. Gold is precious but soft. Silver, less precious but slightly harder. Bronze is for war. Iron is brutally hard and violent. As you move down, the empires become less glorious, but more ruthlessly powerful.
And Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, the glorious, current, invincible power.
But the lasting word, the ultimate point of the vision, is what comes at the end.
Right, the stone.
Yes. Daniel immediately points past Babylon, past silver, bronze, and iron, to the appearance of the stone cut without hands.
Meaning not by human effort?
Exactly. A direct intervention of the divine. This stone strikes the statue at its weakest point, the mixed iron and clay feet, and crushes the whole structure into dust. And then the stone itself grows to fill the entire earth.
So the message was clear. Babylon was magnificent.
But it was merely the first in a temporary sequence, destined for replacement by the eternal kingdom of God.
That is a truth designed to completely dismantle imperial pride. Yet Nebuchadnezzar appears to have only absorbed the flattery, the head of gold, and missed the warning.
He missed it completely, because in Daniel 3, we see his pride immediately renewed in the form of the fiery furnace.
His reaction is pure human resistance.
It is. Daniel revealed that the kingdoms of men are temporary. So Nebuchadnezzar's response is to erect a massive golden image, 90 feet tall, commanding universal submission.
It's a defiant reassertion of his own glory.
A monolithic representation of the head of gold demanding eternal allegiance.
And this leads to the famous, uncompromising refusal of Daniel's three companions.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And their refusal is a masterpiece of faithful resolve. They state plainly that their God is able to rescue them.
But even if he chooses not to?
Even if he doesn't, they will not serve the king's gods or worship the golden image, and Nebuchadnezzar, predictably, is filled with rage.
He orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter.
And then the miracle occurs. The king sees 4 figures walking unbound in the midst of the flames.
The 4th figure.
Described as being like a son of the gods. And they emerge unharmed, without even the smell of smoke on their clothes.
Nebuchadnezzar is stunned. He reverses his decree. He praises their God.
But, and I think this distinction is vital, he praises the God who rescues.
So is this genuine conversion or just acknowledgement of superior power?
The source makes it clear. It's not full submission yet. He acknowledges the God of the Hebrews as a powerful deity, one capable of performing miracles. But he still hasn't bowed his own heart and acknowledged that this God is the most high sovereign over him and his empire.
He's impressed, but his pride remains unchallenged.
Exactly. That ultimate painful lesson required a direct, personal, and profoundly humiliating confrontation.
And that confrontation is the dream of the tree and the humbling in Daniel 4. This is the clear turning point in his personal story.
A dramatic warning. The king dreams of a mighty tree reaching to the sky, providing shelter for the entire world, a perfect symbol for his empire.
But then,
A watcher, a holy one, commands the tree to be cut down, leaving only a stump bound with iron and bronze.
A clear prophecy of a complete sudden demotion from glory to helplessness.
And Daniel interprets it, and his counsel is remarkable. He urges the king to repent. He says, break off your sins, show mercy to the oppressed. The only cure is to renounce sin and acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth.
And the consequence Daniel spells out is almost unbelievable.
It is that the king will be driven out, lose his reason, and live like an animal for 7 periods of time until he makes that final, necessary acknowledgment.
And the speed of the judgment is terrifying.
A whole year passes. Nebuchadnezzar evidently ignores the warning.
He lets the flattery and the magnificence of his city overwhelm him.
Exactly. 1 year later, on the rooftop of his palace, he walks and boasts, using the most damning words possible. Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, for the glory of my majesty?
That rooftop voice, the sound of absolute, unbridled, self-referential pride.
And judgment is instantaneous. Before the words are fully out of his mouth, a voice from heaven declares his rule has departed.
He loses his reason, his sanity.
The very thing that distinguishes man from beast. He's stripped down to the level of basic dependent existence, eating grass like an ox until the critical moment arrives.
When he finally lifted his eyes to heaven.
What a powerful physical lesson in irony. The man who boasted in his massive building projects was suddenly shown that his wealth, his power, and even his sanity were simply gifts, not rights.
He was reduced from conqueror to creature.
And that profound humiliation was the path to his restoration. When he finally looked up and confessed God's eternal rule, his reason was restored, his kingdom returned, and his voice became one of high praise for the Most High.
Nebuchadnezzar's story ends with his restoration and praise. But the narrative of Babylon itself continues for one more generation, moving swiftly toward judgment in Daniel 5.
And this seems deliberate, doesn't it? To show what happens when the lesson of divine sovereignty is ignored.
Absolutely. Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Belshazzar, displays this profound spiritual arrogance that his predecessor had to be so painfully cured of.
Belshazzar, fully aware of his grandfather's story, holds a drunken feast, and in an act of absolute profanity, orders the sacred gold and silver vessels from the Jerusalem temple to be brought out and used for common revelry.
They took the vessels of the living God and made them instruments of their own idolatry.
And that sacrilege brings immediate final judgment. A disembodied hand writes a message on the wall.
The writing on the wall.
Daniel, now an old man, is called in and delivers the meaning. Mene, tekel, upharsin is a divine audit, numbered, weighed, and found wanting.
That very night.
That very night, the kingdom falls to the Medes and Persians.
The head of gold was gone. The seemingly eternal power that had crushed Jerusalem was itself crushed in a single night.
It underscores the point of the statue vision perfectly. The head of gold gave way to the chest and arms of silver. The invincible empire was simply a stage piece in God's larger, unfolding drama, subject to a divine calendar.
That brings us powerfully to part 3, theological significance. We've examined the history and the dramatic narrative. Now let's synthesize. What did this spectacular history of humiliation and restoration actually reveal about the nature of God's rule? What are the enduring truths?
Yeah, the first truth is the most challenging for our modern sensibility. God rules over nations and uses even pagan kings to carry out his purposes.
This is the paradox we identified at the beginning. God calling Nebuchadnezzar my servant. How do we wrestle with the idea of a cruel, idolatrous, pagan king being an instrument of the holy God?
It requires us to distinguish between God's command and God's approval.
Okay.
God did not approve of Nebuchadnezzar's idolatry or his cruelty or his pride, but he commanded the outcome. Nebuchadnezzar was motivated by his own ambition, but that ambition ran along the tracks laid down by divine purpose.
So God, in his sovereignty, handed lands into the king's power for a specific time and a specific purpose.
Which was the discipline of Judah for their covenant unfaithfulness.
So the king acts, driven by free will and ambition, but God rules, confining those actions to his predetermined ends.
Precisely. And that discipline was not random chaos. It had a set length, 70 years.
Right.
Which means every siege, every victory, every decree Nebuchadnezzar made was contained by a divine calendar. And this is the ultimate comfort. No earthly political force is ever truly autonomous.
Proverbs 21.1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the Lord's hand.
Turned wherever he wills.
The second enduring truth addresses the king's internal struggle. Human pride collapses under God's glory.
This is the central, painful lesson from the rooftop.
Yeah.
Daniel 4 is fundamentally an anti-pride document. The king, who boasted in his own immense wealth, learned in the most personally devastating way possible that breath and sanity are gifts, not rights.
His fall demonstrated that God is easily able to humble those who walk in pride.
When the king was reduced to eating grass, the whole world saw that the greatest human power is entirely dependent on the continuous grace of the Creator.
And if Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, was subject to this humbling, the application clearly extends to us.
It does. Our source makes it clear that every heart that boasts, whether in intellectual skill, professional achievement, or even moral superiority, stands on that same dangerous edge. Nebuchadnezzar's humbling is a stark warning against self-sufficiency. It reminds us that no king is saved by the size of his army. True security rests on hoping in God's unfailing love.
The only way up to true, stable glory begins by looking up.
By recognizing that we are completely dependent creatures.
And that theological recognition leads us to the third truth. God's plan moves toward an unshakable kingdom.
The statue vision provides the essential blueprint for this. It's far more than political history. It's a prophecy establishing a clear sequence of Gentile rule leading toward a specific eternal climax.
Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome.
And then it points beyond them all to the final transcendent kingdom set up by the God of heaven.
So Nebuchadnezzar was the magnificent head of gold in a defined temporary line of Gentile rule.
That's correct. Jesus himself later referred to this extended period as the times of the Gentiles, and the vision guarantees that this entire historical phase, marked by human failure and violence, will eventually end.
When the stone, the coming kingdom, crushes the final, fragmented phase of human rule.
And fills the earth with peace and justice.
When we read this today, we often have to wrestle with the complex final interpretation of that kingdom.
The source recognizes this tension, noting the differing views among believers. Some emphasize the future restoration of ethnic Israel. Others emphasize the church as the one new people in Christ.
But the core unifying herb remains solid.
It does. Earthly kingdoms are temporary, Christ's kingdom is eternal, and the return of the king is the guaranteed endpoint of human history.
And threaded through all of this is that powerful theme of judgment and mercy.
This theme is so vital for the believer. The God who used Babylon to violently chastise Judah is the same God who preserved a remnant by pure grace.
Right.
He even gave them that strange, counterintuitive command: seek the peace of the city where they were exiled. He promised not annihilation, but a measured return.
And we see that same principle, mercy, extended after necessary judgment applied to the pagan king himself.
Absolutely. The same God who had to strip the proud ruler of his reason restored him completely, including his kingdom, the moment he lifted his eyes and confessed the truth.
It demonstrates that justice is necessary and real, but it is not the last word where grace is at work.
But that mercy isn't cheap. Nebuchadnezzar had to be utterly broken before he could be rebuilt into a servant capable of genuine praise. Humiliation was the prerequisite for restoration.
That deep synthesis sets us up perfectly for part 4, spiritual lessons and application. Since empires still rise and boast and the headlines constantly try to manipulate our emotional state, what steadying pastoral counsel does Nebuchadnezzar's story offer us as Christians living in this present age?
The counsel is profoundly steadying. It begins with lesson 1. Trade fear of headlines for fear of the Lord.
That's a big one. We watch international events unfold, policies shifting, global powers maneuvering, and it's so easy to feel a paralyzing fear or political despair.
But the truth revealed in Daniel 4 should anchor us. The King of Heaven does as he pleases, and absolutely no one can hold back his hand. The sheer scale of God's control should foster a sense of prayerful steadiness, not passivity or panic.
But practically, what does that look like? If we are facing immense political or cultural pressure in our own cities, how does this fear of the Lord translate into action?
We look at Daniel's example. He served with integrity and excellence in the highest, most corrupt pagan court imaginable.
He was indispensable to the empire.
Yet he maintained his holiness. When threatened, he didn't hide. He prayed with his windows open toward Jerusalem, publicly asserting his primary allegiance.
He trusted God even when it meant the lion's den.
Exactly. Exile and political tension did not extinguish his holiness. They clarified it. We're called to serve our communities well, knowing our ultimate allegiance is to the King who rules all history.
That excellence in service connects directly to lesson 2, holding achievements with open hands.
This is the most personal application of Daniel 4. The great sin of Nebuchadnezzar was his rooftop voice.
Right.
We might not be building Babylon, but we all have moments when we're tempted to stand on the rooftop of our own success, our reputation, our financial independence, and boast. My hands have built this, My wisdom has won this.
That rooftop voice is that insidious whisper that says, I earned this. I control this.
And the cure for that temptation is gratitude and constant remembrance. We have to recall that every single good gift, our strength, our opportunities, our breath comes down from above,
When we recognize that all of our blessings are actually trusts.
loaned to us to be used for the Lord's honor and others' good, then pride loses its destructive power and gratitude flourishes. The warning of Deuteronomy is timeless. Do not say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth,
You shall remember the Lord your God.
for it is he who gives you power to get wealth.
This theme also offers crucial perspective for those who may not be experiencing cultural power, but instead are facing personal loss or humbling. Lesson 3. Comfort for the humbled.
And many listeners may be facing a personal judgment, a collapsed business plan, a failed reputation, the painful realization that their own wisdom wasn't enough. Nebuchadnezzar's fall was extreme, but the key point is that it was not final. For the believer, if God has allowed a season of discipline or a humiliation that exposed reliance on self, this story provides the path through.
When Nebuchadnezzar finally looked up, his reason returned and praise poured out.
And that's the lesson. The Lord meets the broken and contrite heart. He's near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit.
So the path out of personal judgment requires the same steps the king took.
Acknowledging God's right to rule, confessing sin without excuse, and asking for a renewed heart capable of dependence. We have to humble ourselves under God's mighty hand so that he may lift us up in due time.
Turning to the collective life of believers, Lesson 4 deals with the church's task in the present age. Our situation today often mirrors the exiles in Babylon. We are scattered among the nations.
Our power is not in cultural weight or political dominance. We are not a physical temple. We're built into a living spiritual house with Christ as the cornerstone.
So our primary method of engagement with the world must reflect that reality.
It must. Our power, therefore, is solely the gospel message itself. The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. We're called to seek the peace of this city, which means we bless our neighbors and our leaders, even the pagan ones, by bearing witness to Christ with both courage and kindness.
Daniel blessed Nebuchadnezzar by speaking the painful truth.
But he did so respectfully and kindly. Our task is truth and love, not coercion or cultural warfare.
Finally, Lesson 5, reading history with hope. This brings us full circle back to the great statue vision.
The history we observe, the rise and fall of political regimes, is not random chaos. The heads of gold, silver, bronze, and iron pass in order, fulfilling their temporary roles.
Jesus himself taught his disciples to expect turmoil.
To expect these empires to shift and struggle, but to keep watch with faith. He promised that the Son of Man will return with power and glory to set things eternally right.
And until that final moment, our hope should guide our priorities.
We must anchor our hope not in the shifting fortunes of our current systems, but in the eternal. We're called to pray for our rulers, seek the good of our cities, but crucially, to set our hope where thieves cannot break in and moth cannot destroy.
Nebuchadnezzar learned late what every disciple learns early.
Kingdoms shift, but God stands. His rule is eternal and unchangeable.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed with Nebuchadnezzar across the long, painful road from imperial pride, believing he was the author of history, to ultimate, clear praise. His story sets the foundational framework for understanding divine sovereignty over human government.
A timeline that runs far beyond Babylon, through the cross, and toward a coming kingdom that will never pass away. His final personal confession, written after his terrifying ordeal and his ultimate restoration, stands as the enduring testimony for every humbled heart that has finally looked up and found grace.
The statement of a ruler who learned the hard way.
That true dominion belongs only to the Most High. We must take his final words to heart, especially when we feel anxious or powerless regarding the state of the world today.
Listen to his voice.
At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation.
The God who taught a conquering king to worship is the God who meticulously keeps his word, who guides the stream of all history, and who will ultimately bring the kingdoms of this world into the single everlasting kingdom of his Messiah.
So trust him in the interim and let praise have the last word.
May you lift your eyes from the headlines and the chaos of boasting and rage, knowing that everything God does is right and all his ways are just. Amen.